Have you ever felt like you didn't belong, even when you were standing exactly where you were supposed to be? I have. My name is Isaiah Grant, a black man, and in that moment I held a first-class ticket in my hand. Yet I was treated like some freeloader, an unworthy guest. Every condescending glance, every whisper behind my back cut into me like a blade. But I believe this. Dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you carry with every step you take. And sometimes the most powerful response isn't to argue or shout, it's to let the truth speak for itself, to let silence become thunder. They tried to push me down to the lowest seat on the plane. What they didn't know was that I was the one sitting in the highest seat of all, the owner's seat of the entire airline. And that was the moment the game flipped. Hit subscribe, turn on notification, share this story, and leave a comment wherever you're listening. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my journey, it's a mirror held up to anyone who's ever been shoved out of the seat that was rightfully theirs. And now, let's rewind to where it all began. The moment a first-class ticket turned into a test of dignity. I walked into the check-in lobby with a small suitcase rolling smoothly across the polished tile floor. The wheels clattered against the surface, each sound echoing like a drumbeat announcing a trial I never asked for but was about to face anyway. In my hand was a thick, unmistakable first-class ticket. It wasn't just paper. It was the sum of sleepless nights, failed deals, rebuilt dreams, and years of building a life with my own hands. Yet the moment I stepped up to the counter, Clara, the check-in agent, let her eyes linger on me longer than needed. That look wasn't to verify details. It was a weighing, a questioning, the silent phrase forming behind her eyes. Does he really belong here? I knew that look. I had seen it in boardrooms, on sidewalks, in places where people dressed their prejudice in polite words. It was the gaze of someone convinced that this skin outweighed any ticket I could ever hold. I smiled faintly and placed the ticket on the counter. Clara glanced down, then up again, her lips parting, to ask the question I already knew was coming. Are you sure this is your ticket? On the surface, it sounded routine, but beneath it was the quiet accusation. A man like you doesn't belong in first class. Behind me, a man cleared his throat. I didn't need to turn around to feel his eyes pressing into my back. Then came the chuckle, short, sharp, slicing through the air. He murmured to someone beside him, probably printed it wrong. In seconds, the entire lobby felt like a stee, and I had been cast as the punchline without auditioning for the role. My first-class ticket became a prop in someone else's comedy. I stood there, calm but never numb, because this wasn't the first time. I tilted my head slightly, kept the same small smile on my face. No protest, no defense, because I knew the game would play itself out. And sometimes the only way to throw them off balance is to stay perfectly still. Clara tilted her head, suspicion flashing across her eyes. She held the ticket between two fingers, lifting it toward the light as though the word first class might vanish under closer inspection. Her voice was soft, but the edge cut clean. Are you sure this isn't a mistake? The words fell like pebbles, but the ripples spread far and wide. Behind me, Richard Cole chuckled again. Not loud, not long, but sharp enough to lodge itself in the back of my neck like a cold blade. He didn't even bother to hide it. He wanted everyone to hear his amusement over a black man daring to stand in the wrong place. I didn't turn around. But in the reflection of the glossy counter, I caught the stares from the line behind me. They weren't curious eyes waiting to see if a mistake had been made. They were the eyes of self-appointed judges, verdicts ready before the trial even began. Clara kept rotating the ticket as if, with enough time, the ink would confess itself as fake. She glanced at her screen, then at me, then back to the ticket. Every motion dragged out the moment, stretching it like a cheap play where the ending had been written before the curtain rose. Richard spoke again, louder this time. A guy like him? He let the sentence dangle, leaving the audience to fill in the blanks. A few heads shook. Someone sighed. The crowd shifted impatiently, but no one told him to stop. I stood tall, palms resting lightly on the counter. Inside, anger surged hot, but I pressed it down. I knew too well that my reaction would never be read as human frustration. It would be labeled aggressive, uncooperative, threatening. So I smiled, thin, controlled, enough to unsettle them. Because maybe the only real mistake here wasn't on the ticket, but in the way they defined first class. I stayed silent. Sometimes silence forces people to hear their own words ricocheting back at them. Clara shifted, clearly unprepared for my lack of defense. She waited for me to plead my case, to stumble, to look ashamed so she could feel justified. I gave her nothing. I let the space hang heavy until even she could hear Richard's smirk echoing off the walls. Inside, the thought rose bitter and heavy. A first-class ticket in my hand still weighs less than the color of my skin. I knew if this ticket belonged to anyone else, she would have glanced once and waved them through. But in my hand, it became Exhibit A in a trial I never volunteered for. The line behind me shifted, impatient but silent. Their silence was its own kind of complicity. Every sigh, every raised eyebrow, every look that slid away instead of stepping forward. Each one helped cement suspicion as fact. Clara finally set the ticket down, fingers tapping the keyboard, eyes still flicking toward me like I was a forgery, waiting to be exposed. Richard cleared his throat again, deliberate this time. We'll be here all day if they keep letting people like this hold up the line. Laughter, small, quick, poisonous, scattered behind me. I drew in a slow breath, cool air filling my chest. I didn't move. Because this was only the opening act. They thought the question was whether a black man could hold a first-class ticket. The real question was whether first class was big enough to hold the truth about to walk in. I rolled my suitcase toward the boarding gate, the line of passengers snaking slowly across the polished floor like a patient serpent. Overhead, the electronic board flashed first-class boarding in calm blue letters. On paper, the message welcomed everyone. But I knew better. Some welcomes came with conditions. I handed over my ticket with the same smooth motion as the others before me. The scanner beeped, sharp and flat. For most people, that sound meant, please proceed. For me, it was the opening note of suspicion. Brian, the gate agent, looked up at the screen, his brows tightening. He wasn't just reading the passenger list, he was reading me. My face, my skin, my posture. I'd met his kind of scrutiny before, the kind that says the data on the screen isn't enough. They need their prejudice to double-check the facts. Brian didn't wave me through. He motioned for another agent to join him. Whispers rippled behind me. A woman's voice rose, not loud but sharp enough to slice through the air. What's the holdup? I felt the weight of the entire line pressing in. Impatience, irritation, as if my very presence had stalled the flow of travelers who expected everything to move for them. Meanwhile, the white passengers behind me, one beep, one nod. Through they went. No delays, no second looks, no questions. Brian tapped a few keys, then leaned toward his coworker. They stared at the monitor together like it held a riddle too complex to solve. But I knew the truth. The mystery wasn't on the screen. It was standing right here in my skin. I stayed upright, gaze fixed ahead. One thought slid through, bitter and dry. A first-class ticket might cost thousands, but apparently it still buys less than the right to walk through this gate without suspicion. The jet bridge loomed just beyond, but right now it felt less like an entrance and more like a checkpoint where my patience was the only passport. Brian held my ticket, then asked for ID. I handed it over silently. He scanned it once. Then, as if the first pass meant nothing, he nodded to his coworker. Run it again. My ID slid through the machine a second time. Behind me, the scanner kept beeping steadily for the others. Beep, nod, pass, beep, nod, pass. For them, it was a rhythm of convenience. For me, the same beep had turned into a command. Stop, wait, prove yourself again. Someone in line muttered, loud enough to hit my ears. This is taking forever. The sighs that followed fell like pebbles between my shoulder blades. Each one said what no one had the courage to speak aloud. You're the problem here. Brian peered at my ID again, frowning like it held some impossible contradiction. But I knew what he was really searching for. Not an error in the system, an error in me. To them, my first-class ticket was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Accepting it meant accepting that I belonged here. And they weren't ready for that. Meanwhile, the line kept moving. White passengers glided through with a single beep, the way a hand passes through water without resistance. I stayed still, so still that my silence became its own kind of mirror, reflecting the unfairness in every impatient shuffle, every side-eye glance. The scanner beeped again for someone behind me, an invitation for them, a barrier for me. I almost laughed. The machine can't tell the difference between black and white, and yet somehow it keeps speaking two different languages. I glanced up at the blue letters flashing overhead. First class boarding. So neutral, so inviting, as if it were calling everyone. But standing there, I realized the message wasn't a welcome at all. For me, it was a dare. Are you sure you belong here? Brian finally handed back my ticket with a curt nod. You're good. Go ahead. I took it. The paper cooled between my fingers. But I knew the truth. This wasn't permission. It was surrender. Like they were reluctantly letting a trespasser slip deeper inside before someone stopped him again. I stepped through. The scanner beeped, this time meaning accepted. But in my head, it sounded different. The low snicker of prejudice, the slow clap of doubt, the whisper saying I'd only made it through by accident, not by right. As I walked past, I felt the stares following me. A few people even raised their phones, recording as though a black man crossing into first class was rare enough to document. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle, my back straight. Every step was its own rebuttal. But the question lingered, heavy as my carry-on. If every doorway turns into a checkpoint, when will we finally get to walk through as human beings, not suspects? The first-class cabin waited ahead, but I knew the real test had only just begun. I stepped into the first-class cabin, where soft lighting pooled over each seat like tiny private thrones. The air carried the smell of leather and walnut, the kind of luxury scent that turned the cabin into a closed-off club for the chosen few. A handful of passengers were already seated, speaking in low, measured tones, their quiet laughter sounding like proof that they belonged here. A world apart from the rest of the plane. I rolled my suitcase down the aisle, its wheels going silent against the carpet. The sound disappeared, but the eyes didn't. They turned toward me, lingering, unblinking. Each stare slid over me like an X-ray, cutting past the jacket, past the ticket in my hand, straight to the color of my skin. I knew these faces. The white businessman in the perfectly cut suit, the blonde woman with a silk scarf tied just so, the old man flashing a gold watch too big for his wrist. None of them spoke. They didn't have to. A single extra beat in their gaze asked the same question. When did he wander in here? First class, in the way they behaved, wasn't just about wider seats or better service. It was a private ritual, a small chapel where presence itself had to be earned through skin tone and pedigree, not through a ticket that spelled first class in bold letters. I lifted my bag toward the overhead bin, a simple action, nothing unusual, but in the thick, silent air of all those eyes, it felt like a declaration. I'm here and I'm not asking permission. Still, the tension tightened around me, invisible but unmistakable, as if the entire cabin were waiting to see who would try to stop me first. The faint smell of coffee drifted from the galley, tugging at old memories. All the places I'd been told weren't for me. All the times I'd sat behind glass watching rooms like this from the outside. Only this time, I was inside. And yet, my presence didn't make me one of them. It only made them more curious, more defensive, as though they needed to reinforce the invisible walls around their privilege. One thought cut through me, bitter and sharp. Sometimes the price of the ticket is the cheapest thing you'll pay. The real cost is the right not to be looked at like an imposter. I was sliding my bag into the overhead when a voice cut through the air, loud enough for everyone to hear. You know this is first class, right? Coach is back there. I turned. No surprise. Richard Cole, the same man who had chuckled at the check-in counter, sat in 2A, one arm sprawled across the aisle like a barrier only he could control. His face wore the satisfaction of someone enforcing rules that didn't exist on paper, but lived comfortably in his mind. The words were barely out of his mouth before the stares multiplied, sharper now, heavier. They carried no sound, but the message was loud. You don't belong here. A middle-aged woman shook her head, her silk scarf trembling. A young man leaned forward, eyes bright with the thrill of potential drama. Even the flight attendant nearby stayed frozen, as though curious how far this scene would go before stepping in. I held the suitcase a beat longer, then calmly slid it into the bin. The movement was slow, deliberate, my answer without words. I know exactly where I am. I don't need your permission. Richard smirked, his voice dropping just enough to carry. Some folks think a ticket can change everything. A ripple of chuckles rolled through the rows, quick and mean, like sparks skittering across dry wood. I drew a slow breath, kept my eyes forward. Because I knew one thing. Any reaction from me would never be heard as the truth. It would only be remembered as aggression. So I let silence do the work instead, letting Richard's words dangle in the air until they sagged under their own weight. Inside, a smile tugged at me. Small, cold, private. Funny how they call first class spacious, yet the moment I sit down, it shrinks to fit only their arrogance. I locked the bin, turned, and sat in 2B, right next to Richard. The seat was wide, plush, built for comfort. But the moment I settled in, the entire cabin seemed to tighten, the air drawn taut by the discomfort radiating from every row. Richard glanced at me, long and slow, adjusting his tie like a man reclaiming territory. He cleared his throat loudly, broadcasting the news. He actually sat down. The other passengers looked on, curiosity sharpening into expectation. How long before someone came to move me? How long before order was restored? I leaned back, fastened my seatbelt, my hand resting steady on the armrest. Around me, the murmurs grew, small but insistent, like mosquitoes whining in the dark. And through it all, one thought came, cool and certain. They think I'm the outsider, but they have no idea how wrong they are about to be. Because for them, this seat was just a temporary perk. For me, it was the opening move. Every glance, every smirk, every whispered word, they were laying down cards they thought would win the hand. But the game hadn't even started. I watched the flight attendant avoid my eyes. I saw the old man clutch his armrest, the young woman hiding her grin behind her wine glass. The quiet buzz of a room convinced it knew how this story ended. I smiled, faint and sharp. Not the smile of someone amused, but the kind you wear when you already know the twist waiting in the final act. They thought I was in the wrong seat. But the real punchline was this. When the truth arrived, it wouldn't be me sitting in the wrong story. It would be them. I had barely settled into my seat, hadn't even unbuckled the belt to adjust when a shadow fell across the aisle. Melissa, the head flight attendant. Navy scarf folded into a perfect knot, uniform crisp enough to cut glass, heels tapping softly against the carpet. The airline's idea of elegance and professionalism wrapped into one. But what struck me wasn't the perfection of her posture. It was the smile. A thin, polite smile stretched just enough, placed exactly where it should be, yet stripped of warmth. A smile rehearsed 1,000 times until it no longer meant welcome. Sometimes perfection reveals more than it hides. Melissa leaned slightly, eyes locking on me as though the entire cabin had vanished, and I was the only subject in her frame. There was restraint in her gaze, the kind that comes when someone is forcing sweetness to cover the steel underneath. The air tightened. Richard tilted his head, waiting for the scene to unfold. The woman with the silk scarf lowered her magazine a fraction, eyes gleaming. A few passengers straightened in their seats. Everyone knew Melissa wasn't here to offer champagne. The way she walked, the way she held that practiced smile, this was no service call. This was an eviction notice wrapped in customer service tones. I sat still, watching her. Her smile was like a slap delivered in velvet gloves. Quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. And I thought, even sweetness can be a weapon when it tells you that you don't belong here. Melissa bent closer, voice soft but pitched, so the entire cabin could hear. "Sir, this seat is already assigned. I'm afraid we'll have to move you to economy. As a courtesy, the airline will offer you a complimentary drink voucher." Light words, a heavy message. Richard chuckled, swirling his wine like this was free entertainment. The silk scarf woman folded her magazine with a satisfied snap. A young man tilted his phone upward, recording discreetly, the glow of his screen capturing my moment. A low ripple of whispers passed through the cabin, a secret chorus of approval. Every raised eyebrow, every sideways glance pressed against me, framing me as the intruder finally unmasked. Melissa held her smile, but I could see the arrogance tucked into its corners. A drink voucher. A sugar cube tossed to cover the taste of humiliation. Their way of saying, you don't belong here, but here's a soda on the way down. Somewhere behind me, someone muttered, knew it, he wouldn't last long. I didn't move. I let them see it, that I wasn't a confused passenger in the wrong seat, wasn't someone willing to leave just because they wrapped the word leave in politeness. My stillness stretched the moment thin, turned it uncomfortable until Melissa's smile froze for half a second. She wasn't used to this, a passenger refusing to play his assigned role in her script. The murmurs grew louder. Richard laughed again, the smug, nasal kind. Someone whispered about calling security. Heads tilted toward one another, gossip riding the recycled air. I stayed calm, hands resting on the armrest like I had all the time in the world. My silence wasn't surrender, it was a mirror. In it, Melissa and the rest of the cabin could see themselves, the impatience, the hunger to see me leave, the quiet pleasure of watching dignity get escorted out. And in that mirror, I thought, how many times have we been told to leave? Not because we were wrong, but because they couldn't stand to see us stay. No one needed to answer. The truth was already here, in Melissa's frozen smile, in the fake apology wrapped around the word economy, in the useless voucher offered like hush money for obedience. I smiled faintly, because I knew this wasn't about a seat. It was their idea of first class that was on trial. The silence thickened until even the air felt heavy. A few phones tilted higher, eager to capture a man about to be put in his place. They didn't realize they were filming something else entirely, evidence of a truth too loud to stay hidden much longer. And I wondered, if every seat can turn into a courtroom, when will a black man get to sit without having to stand trial just for being here? I turned my head, and there she was, seated beside me as though she had been waiting all along. Linda Moore. I recognized the name from the polished luggage tag hanging off her designer suitcase. Her makeup was meticulous, hair a perfectly sculpted wave of blonde, and every fold of her silk dress spoke of wealth presented like a resume. She sat upright, posture regal, as if this entire first-class cabin was her private drawing room. The golden light from the overhead panels caught the glint of her diamond earrings, framing her not just as a passenger, but as a self-appointed gatekeeper of this rarefied space. I could feel her presence, not because she moved, but because she didn't. She glanced at me briefly, not long enough to be overt, but long enough to assess me. That glance carried a silent verdict, weighed, measured, and found lacking. First class was already a closed club, and Linda Moore, with her cool, aristocratic composure, clearly saw herself as a loyal member ready to remind outsiders of the rules. I sat still, the faint trace of her expensive perfume drifting across the narrow space between us. It wasn't just fragrance, it was a declaration. I am here because I deserve to be. It seeped into the air like invisible ink, drawing a line to mark my presence as a blemish on her pristine page. I knew this kind of silence. It was never empty. It was the inhale before the strike. Women like Linda Moore rarely stayed silent for long. Arrogance needs language to breathe, and my existence was the perfect excuse for hers to flare. I leaned back slightly, closed my eyes for a moment. Even then I could feel her gaze pressing against me, the way a knife presses before it slides in. It's never the shouted insults that cut the deepest, I thought. It's the whispers. The ones soft enough to pass as casual, yet sharp enough to leave scars. Linda Moore tilted her head, lips moving as though speaking only to the diamonds at her throat. But her voice carried just enough for me to hear, and for the surrounding rows to hear as well. I told you, she murmured. Black people belong in coach. A silk-soft sentence with the edge of a razor. She didn't need to name me. The words settled over the cabin like dust, impossible to ignore, sharp in their precision. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable click of a phone camera. A young man's voice laced with amusement. Black guy trying first class? This is gonna be good. His words hit the cabin like sparks into dry grass. Laughter followed. First a couple of chuckles, then more, spreading like a ripple over still water. It wasn't loud, not the kind of laughter that erupts at a real joke. This was thinner, meaner. a hiss of blades being sharpened. Richard leaned forward, eyes glittering, a front-row spectator in this little theater. The silk scarf woman hid a smirk behind her hand, pretending to cough. Even the flight attendant nearby stayed silent, wearing the airline's neutral smile as though this humiliation came included in the ticket price. I sat motionless, hearing every snicker, every whisper. But anger wasn't the only thing in me. There was something colder, steadier, the knowledge that this wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last. Funny, I thought. They call this first class, but they've turned it into a schoolyard, the kind where kids pass around cheap jokes instead of notes. I realized then, my silence wasn't weakness. It was bait. The longer I said nothing, the more they revealed themselves. Every chuckle, every hushed slur was a confession slipping out under the weight of its own arrogance. I breathed slowly, evenly, as though I were somewhere else entirely. As though their words were nothing but the hum of the engines outside. It wasn't apathy. It was discipline, the kind honed by years of turning insults into ammunition. Linda Moore kept whispering, her lips moving like she was reciting prayers, each word another needle dipped in sugar. Richard kept glancing, waiting for me to snap so they could enjoy the scene even more. The kid behind me kept filming, convinced he was capturing a spectacle rather than an indictment. I stayed still. To them, it looked like defeat. To me, it was the opposite. Because every raised phone, every smirk caught in its own reflection, was evidence collecting itself. They thought they were laughing at me. They didn't realize they were recording themselves. I let the silence stretch. The longer it lasted, the more their confidence faltered. The laughter thinned, turned awkward, cracked by the weight of its own echo. They didn't understand why I wouldn't react, but I knew exactly why. In this game, the first to lose composure always loses more than the argument. I opened my eyes slowly, gaze fixed ahead, a thin smile curling at the corner of my mouth. It wasn't for them. It was for the moment when every whisper, every giggle, every smirk would come boomeranging back, and they would finally realize the cameras had been facing their side of the story all along. And I wondered, when the recording surfaced, when the laughter was played back in cold clarity, who exactly would be the one exposed? I had barely opened my eyes after that long silence when the familiar figure appeared again in the aisle. Melissa. But this time she wasn't alone. Right behind her was Edward, the cabin manager, tall and thin, his face drawn tight as if summoned to an emergency meeting. Melissa's practiced smile was gone. In its place was something sharper, a kind of professional severity that she wore like armor. Her voice carried no trace of sweetness now. Each word fell with deliberate weight. "Sir, we need to resolve this situation." Edward stood beside her, hands clasped neatly in front, his expression arranged into neutrality. But I caught it. The flicker in his eyes, the quick assessment as he looked at me, the look of a man weighing whether to protect the dignity of first class or remove the source of discomfort. The entire cabin went still. The snickers, the whispers, the quiet cruelty, all of it evaporated into a heavy, expectant silence. Passengers leaned forward slightly, like theatergoers sensing the climax approaching. Richard adjusted his posture, eyes bright with anticipation. Linda tilted her head, satisfaction flickering across her face as though the proper authorities had finally arrived to restore order. I sat motionless, back straight, eyes on the two figures in front of me. I didn't need to guess what was coming. The script in moments like these was always the same. The polite opening, the apology dipped in customer service sugar, followed by the real blow, the request to leave. Leave the seat. Leave the cabin. Leave so they could have their unbothered version of first class again. Melissa inhaled sharply, her gaze fixed on me. Edward shifted slightly, the tendons in his hands tightening as if preparing for intervention should I resist. Inside, I thought, with a bitter kind of humor. They call flight attendants the friendly face of the airline. Yet here they stand, in uniform and lipstick, the undercover police of an unwritten law. I breathed slowly, my fingers tightening slightly on the armrest. I knew this moment was about more than a seat. It was about existence, about my right to remain in a place I had already paid for. Then Melissa spoke again. This time there was no disguise in her tone. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to call security." The cabin came alive, not with sound, but with the electricity of anticipation. Eyes lit up instantly. It was as if someone had announced the best part of the show was about to begin. No one needed popcorn or a screen. First class itself had become the stage. Richard straightened, neck craning slightly, face glowing with the thrill of coming spectacle. Linda smoothed the silk scarf at her throat, a small smile touching her lips. The kind of smile reserved for someone watching justice, as they defined it, being served. The young man with the phone lifted it higher, lens ready, no doubt already scripting the caption in his head. "Black passenger escorted from first class." I stayed still, eyes locked on Melissa. Her voice carried the steady rhythm of professionalism, but I saw the tension in her fingers, the way her nails dug faintly into her palm. She knew this wasn't routine. She knew this was the moment the cabin wanted. The strike that would fix the disruption my presence had caused. Edward beside her kept his posture stiff, neutral on the surface but coiled underneath, waiting for a single nod from me to turn into a call for backup. I let my gaze drift over the cabin. Richard leaning forward like a man at the opera. Linda, scarf gleaming, eyes bright with quiet triumph. The phones, the tilted heads, the audience holding its collective breath. And strangely, I didn't feel like the defendant in this little courtroom. I felt like the director, watching actors hit their marks without realizing the script had shifted long ago. Because here was the truth. Every second they waited for me to explode, to argue, to give them the drama they craved, was a second I refused to surrender. I breathed slowly, sat still. Melissa expected fear, or at least irritation, something she could label uncooperative to justify the next step. But I gave her nothing. That was when her smile faltered. Just slightly. It returned a moment later, thinner this time, stretched over uncertainty she hadn't planned for. Edward glanced between us, shoulders tight, ready but hesitant. Because removing someone who yells is easy. Removing someone silent, someone composed, that stains the whole performance. I realized then, my stillness was louder than anything I could have said. The cabin's hush deepened, thick as fog. Even the air vents seemed to hum quieter. Richard frowned faintly. Linda bit her lip. The boy with the camera shifted, restless now, lens jittering as though trying to force the climax into existence. But there was nothing for them to film except their own waiting. Because in their hunger to see me dragged away, they had revealed themselves. Every whisper, every smirk, every breathless pause. I didn't need to shout to expose them. They were doing it for me. And as the seconds passed, I wondered, if my silence could shake first class this much, what would happen when the truth finally spoke out loud? The air in the cabin was thick, strung tight like a violin about to snap. I sat still, but every pair of eyes around me clung to my shoulders. Some waited for me to stand up. Some waited for the call for security. Some waited for the drama they were certain they knew the ending to. Then the cockpit door swung open. A figure stepped out. Captain Harris. His footsteps landed firm and deliberate, echoing over the carpet like the drum beats of an opening act. The Navy uniform, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, the cap in his hand. He wasn't a flight attendant, wasn't some mid-level employee. He was the man who commanded the entire aircraft, the symbol of authority at 30,000 feet. The entire cabin went silent. Melissa stiffened. Edward shifted back half a step. Richard straightened, surprise flickering across his face. Linda adjusted her posture, her eyes gleaming with expectation. Perhaps she thought the captain would deliver the line they'd all been waiting for. That final confirmation that I didn't belong here. But I was different. I looked at Harris with calm eyes, lips pressed together, silent. Deep down, I knew this moment wouldn't just be a conversation. It would be a turning point. Harris walked toward me, each step measured, unhurried, like a man carrying gravity in his stride. The whispers in the cabin faded, swallowed by a dense, anticipatory hush. I could hear my own heartbeat. Not from fear, but from the sense that fate sometimes arrives dressed in a pressed uniform, its footsteps as heavy as a judge's gavel. The captain stopped at my row, stood tall. His eyes locked on mine. Around us, the entire cabin leaned forward, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the verdict to drop. I didn't move. I let the silence swell, a balloon stretched to its limit, one breath away from bursting. Harris bent slightly, voice steady, carrying clearly through the first-class cabin. "Mr. Grant, the board of directors has just confirmed it. You are now the new owner of this airline." The words fell like a rare sound of truth. Not loud, not rushed, but heavy enough to shatter the air. Richard froze, the glass in his hand tilting, whiskey sloshing dangerously near the rim. Linda, the same Linda who had whispered her little knives of words earlier, "Swata woody mommy," swallowed hard, the silk scarf at her throat seeming to tighten. The young man with the live stream fumbled with his phone, muttering, "Wait, what?" Melissa's face drained of its practiced confidence, the professional smile cracking, replaced by a flicker of something raw. Shock, maybe even shame. Edward cleared his throat, still trying to look neutral, but his eyes betrayed the instinct to disappear. I stayed seated, leaning back, receiving the announcement with the composure of someone who had already seen this ending before it was written. Because I knew. The truth always arrives late, long after prejudice has strutted around unchecked. The cabin was dead silent. No more laughter. No more whispers. Only the weight of a revelation they hadn't prepared for, hanging over their heads like the echo of a slammed door. Inside, I allowed myself a small, private smile. How poetic, I thought. They wanted to watch me dragged out. Instead, they're watching their own arrogance collapse in real time. Captain Harris remained there, a living mirror of the reversal now sweeping through the cabin. And I knew this moment wasn't just changing my position. It was rewriting the rules for everyone in this so-called first class. After his words, the air shifted, as if someone had yanked the oxygen out of the room. Those same faces, so smug a moment ago, now stiffened, warped like wax under sudden heat. The live stream chat exploded, comments flooding in. "Wait, he's the CEO?" "Unbelievable. Racism exposed live." The young man with the camera stammered. Well, folks, you heard it here first." No longer the narrator of a takedown, but the accidental host of his own humiliation. I rose slowly. No hurry, no theatrics. Just one simple motion that made the entire cabin hold its breath. Turning to Harris, I nodded once in thanks. Then my eyes swept across the faces that had watched me with open disdain only moments ago. I didn't need a speech. The truth had spoken for me in one sentence from the captain's mouth. Still, I let my voice carry, calm and deliberate. "I think I'll sit right here in my own seat." It wasn't just a claim to the leather and legroom. It was a line drawn in the air. Between a seat bought with money and a seat claimed with dignity. Richard pulled his hand back from the glass, eyes darting away. Linda's scarf lay twisted now, her lips pressed tight. Melissa's smile returned, but weakly, its power gone. Silence filled the cabin again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of waiting for me to leave. It was the silence of people realizing the story had changed, and they were on the wrong side of it. And I wondered, if one sentence could dismantle this much arrogance, how many more walls would fall when I finally held the controls? I sat back down in my seat, the seatbelt clicking shut with a dry, final snap. A simple, ordinary sound, yet in that moment, it cracked through the cabin like a judge's gavel calling the court to order. No more snickering. No more whispers. The chaos of moments ago had evaporated, leaving behind a thick, heavy quiet. Faces that had glowed with amusement now tilted downward, suddenly fascinated by magazines, phones, or the glasses of wine in front of them. No one met my eyes. It was as though they feared my gaze would reflect something back at them they weren't ready to see. Richard stared out the window, his expression fixed, as though the clouds outside had turned into something worth studying. Linda fiddled with her bracelet, hands trembling slightly, her elegant posture cracking at the edges. The young man with the live stream had lowered his phone, the screen now black, like he didn't want to be caught holding evidence of what he'd just recorded. Melissa tried to reassemble her professional mask, tugging a weak smile back onto her face, but its power was gone. Edward remained standing beside her, stiff and restless, as if he'd give anything to vanish from the scene entirely. I didn't say a word. I let the silence do the work. This wasn't the same silence as before. Not the silence of waiting or of mockery. This was the silence of recognition. The moment people realize the balance of power has shifted while they weren't paying attention. A private smile flickered at the corner of my mouth. How ironic, I thought. All I had to do was stay in my seat, and first class turned into a classroom. And now the whisperers sit here like guilty schoolchildren caught mid-laugh. The air hummed with the steady drone of the AC. Glasses clinked softly. But no one spoke. Because in that moment, every sound carried the weight of confession. I leaned back, eyes half closed, not from exhaustion, but because I knew silence had become the loudest language in the room. No one dared break it. A cabin full of people, wrapped in a silence so thick it pressed down on them like a weight. Not a peaceful silence. Not a gentle one. A silence that exposed. Richard sat rigid, his gaze locked on the blinding white clouds like he might find salvation there. Linda smoothed the silk scarf at her neck, each motion precise yet trembling, as though trying to erase the memory of the words she had let slip. Melissa bent over her clipboard, scribbling nonsense in jittery lines that led nowhere. And me? I sat in the middle of it all, unmoving, saying nothing, doing nothing. My presence alone pulled the silence tighter like a drum skin stretched to the edge of tearing. They had expected an outburst, some messy explosion to prove their point about me. But I gave them nothing. And in doing so, I stripped away the last of their excuses, leaving only the naked truth of their own discomfort. It was almost funny. First class was designed for luxury. Leather seats, fine wine, warm lighting. Yet here it was, transformed into the backdrop for something else entirely. A theater where wealth and privilege shrank beneath the weight of a single quiet man, refusing to move. I glanced around. They looked trapped in glass cages, pretending to read, to text, to sip their drinks. But the silence betrayed them. It rang louder than any insult they'd thrown minutes earlier. So silence does have a sound, I thought. And today, it's louder than their laughter ever was. The cabin felt like a classroom when the teacher walks in mid-chaos. Only this time, I didn't have to slam a desk or raise my voice. They had already condemned themselves with their averted eyes and nervous hands. And I wondered, now that silence had become a verdict, would any of them dare speak again? I leaned back, the seatbelt snug around my waist, sealing the scene shut like the last page of a book. First class sat frozen. No one daring to break the air, no one willing to meet my eyes. I felt the tension in the smallest things. The clink of a spoon too loud against a glass. The nervous flutter of a magazine page turned too slowly. I didn't need another word. Truth had spoken already. They had looked at me like I didn't belong. But now they sat there, each one exposed as the intruders in their own story. I let a slow smile spread, then spoke for the last time. My voice low, steady, falling like the final strike of a gavel. They tried to send me to coach, but tell me, how do you downgrade a man who just bought the sky? How many times have black folks been pushed out of their seats? And how many times will we come back? Not just to sit, but to own the whole cabin. The words dropped, heavy as stone. No one answered. But I knew they'd echo long after we landed. Linda's head bowed slightly. Richard's fingers drummed once against the armrest, then stopped. Melissa turned away, lips pressed tight. Outside the window, the sky stretched wide and endless. The plane hadn't even left the ground yet, but I knew in that moment I had already risen higher than anyone here. Not because of money, not because of power, but because I stayed in my seat and let the truth drag them into the light. The silence held. And beneath it, a question beat on, unanswered. How many times will they shove us out of the seats that are ours? And how many times will we come back, not just to sit, but to rewrite the rules of the entire room? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.